Every time I hear Nemo Patel's planting seeds, it makes me happy. I love the images in the video, I love the lyrics, and even more, I love the message. Based on Nelson Henderson's quote, that the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit, it always makes me think about what seeds I may be planting, what seeds I have planted, and what seeds I need to plant now and in the future. For me, that's been a good and thoughtful exercise. I really like to think about what I and others have done that have affected other people, how we have hopefully moved the arc of history towards justice, or how we've made the world a better place, even when we may not see the end results of what we've started. I'm going to tell you 3 stories, 2 of individuals and 1 of a group of people who planted seeds, even though they didn't necessarily sit under the shade of their work. They lived at different times, but they made real contributions to the world we live in now. So who am I going to talk about today? Susan B. Anthony, Maya ActiveX, and the forward-thinking group of folks who founded Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation. Unitarians all, they planted seeds that give us welcome shade today. Susan B. Anthony, and if I can have the slides, I didn't sort of plan this enough. If I go like this, will you change a slide? This is my PowerPoint, and I have several pictures of Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was, there she is, as about a 40-year-old. She was born in 1820 in upstate New York into a Quaker family which supported the abolition of slavery and equality for everyone. She was educated well for a woman of her time and became a teacher where she first experienced discrimination because she was a woman. Brought in to replace a male teacher who had been fired for incompetence, she was offered a little less than half his salary. When she objected, she was told no women were worth more than half of what a man was worth. She took the job, but complained to her family about that unfairness. While Susan was away teaching, the first meeting ever held on women's rights was convened by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and more than 150 people attended, including Susan's parents and her sister. It's now a national park, by the way. I urge you to go. When she first heard about it, she wasn't impressed, given what other things were wrong with the world, especially slavery, but her family convinced her that women's lack of rights was tied to all oppression and urged her to join, reminding her of the discrimination she herself had experienced. At this time, women had few rights, and married women essentially had none. They were dead in the law, under the legal concept of femme couverte, covered woman. As the eminent scholar Blackwell wrote, "The husband and wife are one, and that one is the husband." Married women had no right to own property, to control their wages if they worked, or to have access to their husband's wages if the husband didn't want them to have it. They had no right to inherit, no right to contract, no right to guardianship of their children, no right to vote, of course, and actually were considered unable to technically commit a crime because they had no true legal status independent of their husbands. In 1851, Susan met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and one of the greatest political partnerships in the history of American history began. While Elizabeth was a great writer and speaker, Susan was an incredible organizer and ultimately became the most famous public face of feminism in the world. About the time she joined the women's movement, she left her Quaker faith, as did her family, and they all became Unitarians. She stopped wearing the traditional Quaker gray clothing and began to bring color into her life, though you can't tell it by that picture, wearing a red shawl almost every day. One of her shawls is in the Smithsonian History Museum with her desk. And her house is open as a history museum in Rochester, and it's fantastic. At the beginning of her political life, Susan, along with other major leaders, Lucy Stone, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, both Unitarians, and Elizabeth, gave as much time to anti-slavery work as women's rights, and they pressed tirelessly during the Civil War for the abolition of slavery, siding with the radical Republicans. Radical Republicans in those days were on the side of abolition, who promised at the end of the war slavery would be ended and women would get the right to vote. When women did not achieve suffrage at the end of the war, Susan and Elizabeth refused to work on anything other than women's rights ever again. That actually caused a split in the women's movement. That's a whole other story. Working tirelessly for her entire life for women's suffrage and equal rights for women, Susan, who never married, for years was the only feminist leader able to sign a contract to rent a hall for meetings, because as a single woman, only she had the right to sign contracts. She traveled the country unceasingly, attending and speaking at more than 400 state and national women's rights conventions, speaking individually before crowds of people, and often threatened with violence. Frequently testifying before Congress and the state legislature on women's rights, she was unstoppable, and we do have a Susan B. Anthony coin, the only money that has women in it. In 1872, Susan convinced the precinct committeeman in Rochester, where she lived, Rochester, New York, to let her vote in the presidential election. Although New York did not allow women to vote, she argued with them that the 14th Amendment, which had just passed, which promises equal protection for all citizens under the law, meant that she had the right to vote because she was a citizen and other citizens, men, were voting. They finally were persuaded and let her vote. She voted and was promptly arrested for the crime of voting. Actually, that's what she wanted, because she hoped to make this a test case to the Supreme Court, which, if she won, would result in a 14th Amendment decision giving women the right to vote all over the United States. She was indeed convicted for the crime of voting and fined $100, which she refused to pay. At her sentencing, she gave one of the finest speeches in American rhetoric, ending with a ringing statement that she would never accept a ruling against her, would pay no fine, would never agree to whatever they said, because resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Ultimately, she was a resistor from the get-go. Ultimately, the politicians in Rochester refused to try to collect the fine, thereby thwarting her ability to appeal the case. Just before her lifelong political partner, Elizabeth, died in 1902, Susan wrote her a letter reflecting on their joint work together. It is 51 years since we first met, and we have been busy through every one of them, stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women. We little dreamed when we began this contest that half a century later we would be compelled to finish the battle to another generation of women. But our hearts are filled with joy to know that they enter upon this task equipped with a college education, with business experience, with the freely admitted to right to speak in public, all of which were denied to women 50 years ago. These strong, courageous, capable young women will take our place and complete our work. There is an army of them where we were but a handful. At her birthday party shortly before her death in 1906, Susan declared, "Failure is impossible," which became a motto of the women's movement. An original resistor, Susan's grave in Rochester was covered with "I voted" stickers this year, when the first woman from a major party for president ran for president in the United States. Although Susan died 14 years before women had the right to vote nationally, the seeds of women's rights she and other women and men planted in our culture have continued to grow and flourish, though she never got to vote or sit beneath the shade of those trees. Maya ActiveX was a Bohemian immigrant and a librarian at New York City Public Library during World War I. When she met Norbert Čapek, a liberal Baptist minister and Czech immigrant in 1916, and that's Maya, I think probably in about her 40s, and that's the only picture I have of her. They fell in love and married in 1917. Not an easy choice for Maya, as Norbert had been married and widowed twice before and had 9 children from his previous marriages. Most of whom were with him, but some of whom, the older ones, were still in Prague, Czechoslovakia. At the end of World War I, Czechoslovakia gained independence, and many immigrants returned. Previously active in the independence movement, Norbert also wanted to go back to Prague, and Maya agreed. As they were preparing to return, their younger children started going to a Unitarian Sunday school, and they loved it. They brought their parents, and both Maya and Norbert knew they had found their new church home, since Norbert had left the Baptist ministry 3 years before over theological issues. They joined the Unitarian Church in 1921 and met the head of the Unitarian Association of America, telling him of their dream to bring Unitarianism to Prague. With the support of the UAA, it was before we joined with the Universalists, Maya and Norbert founded the Unitarian Association of Czechoslovakia and the First Unitarian Church of Prague, which grew to be the largest single Unitarian congregation in the world. Maya was ordained herself in 1926, and their younger daughter and her husband became Unitarian ministers too in the next decade. They were all charismatic preachers, and their church in Prague, ultimately housed in a castle, how cool would that be, had 3,200 members. On the eve of World War II, they had brought the free religious thought of Unitarianism to the 8,000 members of the Unitarian Association of Czechoslovakia, had founded 8 fellowships in cities outside of Prague, a large school in Prague, and the Czechoslovakian Unitarian Seminary. As Hitler rose to power just before the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939, the entire family encouraged Maya to return to the United States to lecture about what was happening in Europe, to raise funds to assist refugees fleeing Hitler, and to assist organizing efforts by the Unitarians and Quakers to help refugees get out to safety in the United States. Most Americans didn't understand what Hitler was doing, nor could they imagine, and really nobody could imagine, what horrors were to come. Maya saw her mission to explain what was happening and to convince Americans to help refugees get out. The Unitarian group she was assisting ultimately became the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which many of us donate to and which has continued. And it still does excellent work for justice all over the world. After several months, Maya wanted to come home, but Norbert and her family argued that she was doing such important work, she should stay in the United States. Once the Germans actually invaded Czechoslovakia, she really couldn't go home, so she continued speaking and organizing. Communications with her family became ever more difficult, though she knew that Norbert and several of their children were working in Prague with the resistance. When Norbert was picked up by the Gestapo for the second time, their daughter also was, and sent to the concentration camp in Dachau, she lost all contact with her family. She did not learn that Norbert had been killed in Dachau until after the war. One of their daughters was also sent to Dachau, but made it through the war. Once America entered World War II, Maya continued to organize relief efforts and foster the new Unitarian Service Committee. She also became the settled minister of the New Bedford, Massachusetts Unitarian Church for 3 years. In 1944, as the United Nations was being formed, she became one of the primary organizers of the new United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, UNRWA, the main resettlement agency for displaced persons after the war. Maya worked full-time for the agency from its beginning in 1944 to 1950 when she retired. She always saw her work as fundamental to her faith as an active Unitarian. She believed in the goodness of humanity, even through some of the darkest days the world has ever seen. UNRWA is still one of the largest and most important international organizations working to help refugees and stateless people today, more than 70 years after its founding. Maya Chopek helped plant the seeds of that organization and the UUSC, which provides such shade today for refugees from all over the world. The third story I want to tell is closer to home. And it's the story of how Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation was founded. In 1963, 54 years ago, a small group of Unitarian Universalists in Tempe met at the Village Inn Pizza Parlor on Rural Road and Apache Boulevard to begin a discussion group and think about forming an East Valley congregation. That restaurant is still there. I'm sorry, can you go back? And it's now the Vine, which still serves pizza and hamburgers and lots of beer. The group formed a committee to look into what they should do and applied for a charter from the UUA, which was granted in 1965. Within a few months of the beginning meetings, and before we got the charter, we met at the nursing college on the ASU campus, several parks, they would have picnics, schools and other churches, and finally the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Mill Avenue. By then, Ray Manker, that's not Ray Manker, that's Betty Nearing, there's Ray Manker. By then, Ray Manker from the Phoenix Unitarian Universalist Church came every Sunday before his service at what is now UUCP to preach to the new group in Tempe. That support was crucial to our founding, as was the strong commitment of the original group, who saw the importance of bringing Unitarian Universalism to the East Valley. Dory Wegner is the last living member of the original group, and we all owe her and all of them a huge thank you. That's Betty Nearing, who just died, for planting the seeds that have become our vibrant congregation. Many of the original members did not know how much shade their seeds would cast, but they planted them anyway, and we are all incredibly grateful. That's James Ford and, oh my gosh, Charlotte Ward. Now I want to ask all of you to think about what seeds you have to plant. And if you can, I'd love it if you would write seed ideas that you might have on Post-it notes that the kids handed out and put them on our tree as we finish our service. Now please join Kelly and her crew and me and Cassidy and the band in singing Planting Seeds. We're going to teach you the chorus. All signs, airplanes, Post-it notes, and general joy are welcome at the end.